Welcome back to Talk on the Street, a public affairs program of the Electric Plant Board. I'm your host, Ron Ellis. Our guests this evening are Steve Newberry, who is chairman of the you'll have to do it for me. I say IDEA.
Industrial Development Economic Authority.
And Walter Davis, a local attorney. Steve supports the referendum to allow alcohol sales in restaurants, and Walter opposes. When we went off, we were talking about my experience in watching the legislature making it easier by creating different vehicles for this. They definitely have done that, and I think we're going to see that continue. Largely, for whether they're right or wrong, they think that it is a boost to the economics of our state. You were saying that some of the communities which have decided in favor of this issue are showing some growth.
Right, and the first thing I want to do, and I want to look square in the camera when I say this, the restaurant issue, this is not for me a nose under the tent and let's expand it and then soon we'll have expanded sales. So I'm saying that I will work harder to oppose expanded sales than I am for the restaurant sales because I don't think that's needed. This is a chart that I put together that has to deal with communities that have announced the economic development in their communities, the limited sales by restaurants, and when plant announcements started. Now, Warren County's at the top. Clearly, they've had liquor sales and alcohol sales, both in package stores and restaurants, for a long time, but they've had economic development announcements throughout this period. Murray and Mayfield, they announced in 2001, their communities voted for it. They started having economic development announcements in 2002 that has continued. They've had some years where they've had no announcements, but they have had certain good growth. Elizabethtown, they voted in 2002. In 2003, they started having announcements. Danville made the selection in 2003, in 2004. Actually, they started serving in 2004, and they started having announcements in 2005. Franklin, you can see the same thing last year in 2005, or year before last in 2005, and then in 2006 they started having announcements. I don't mean to imply in this that you serve in restaurants and all of a sudden the fountains open up. But the reality is that 79% of the announcements made in the state of Kentucky over the past 6 years have been made in communities that have the quality of life issues, the restaurants and other service locations. And this is such an issue. 15 years ago, as I said earlier, 10 years ago, I would have been opposed to this, but having been involved in the economic development, and I should say that there are 6 members of the Industrial Authority. We come from different faiths, we come from different professions, we come from different age groups, we have retirees, we have people that are still active in work. The Industrial Development Authority is going to go on the record unanimously supporting this move, because we see the impact in the community.
You mentioned faith. There is a religious component to this question for most people, is there not, Walter?
Sure. Let me go back, and I haven't seen Steve's chart. Every community that he's listed there has been a growing community for years. Danville has a Donnelly plant that far preceded any wet thing. Murray's a good community. And of course, Elizabethtown and Bowling Green are in a totally different league as far as what they're doing. I'm not going to sit here and say that these communities haven't done anything, but they've been doing things for years. Just because they've had announcements since a wet election, to me, is irrelevant unless you know all of the other factors. The other thing, and I appreciate Steve, I'm going to get a tape of this and take it home, but I've talked to several people that the camel's nose under the tent is very much a part of this, and I think the legislature passed the limited restaurant sales statute to make it easier for communities to be wet. I don't think there's any question about that. That was part of their motivation. They may have had some other motivation, and so I talked to a guy the other night. I handed him a thing, and he said, "I'm voting for it." Because he said, "I don't care anything about voting in restaurants," but he said, "As soon as we get that, it won't be long till we get liquor stores."
I should point out, none of the other communities that have opted for the restaurant sales since 2000, none of them have expanded their sales since that time.
Well,
and that's only been 2 or 3 years.
It's been 7 years.
And I ironically think there are 2 issues to the nose under the camel's nose under the tent, or whatever the metaphor is. Isn't there not only is it more likely to happen? And not only is the legislature, I'm sure in some cases at least, not all members thinking that way, but isn't there also an elitist attitude by not doing it? What about the poor blue-collar worker who's got a couple of kids at home and just enjoys a six-pack with his barbecue? I've always wondered why it was okay to do it in restaurants where perhaps a more affluent clientele went than opposed to the hard-working stuff.
And I think the answer to that for me is because that's what's needed for the economic development growth as a community. We don't need package stores to be able to host out-of-town guests. We don't need package stores or taverns to be able to have representatives from GM stay in our community as opposed to staying in Bowling Green when they come to visit our suppliers. We need restaurant choices. This, for me, is not, I said this earlier, it's not the alcohol issue, it's a restaurant issue, but we absolutely need to expand our restaurant offerings in this community.
Well, let me go back to we talked about the moral or the religious component in this, and I don't want to miss that before our time gets away.
Well, when the petition was first proposed and they had so many days to get the signatures, the statement was made that this is an economic issue, not a moral issue. I think it's both, if you want to know the truth. Even though Steve and I may disagree on the economic impact of this, I think he overstates it. He probably thinks I understate it. So we're even there in that sense. But there are tremendous costs that the use and abuse of alcohol bring. And I'm not going to get into statistics, except I do enjoy reading newspapers. I work with a college group.
We love people who enjoy reading newspapers.
I work with a college group in our church, and I'm always bringing newspaper articles, and I find out, to a great degree, and unless it's on Sports Center, they may not have seen that. But here was something in the Daily Times that said local authorities say drugs, alcohol contribute to roughly $70 billion annual problem. Now, there may be some economic growth somewhere, but I don't think anybody can really deny that there are huge costs. And you can read this and quote our sheriff, such as he says that domestic abuse is a major problem, or one of his deputies in Barron County. A lot of times alcohol is involved and drugs are involved. And so when you say economics has two sides, but there is a moral issue. The other side says there isn't a moral issue. Well, the people that I guess in a sense I'm speaking for says there is a moral issue. And that moral issue has a wide spectrum. There are those who say it's a sin to drink. I respect those people, whether Steve or you or I agree with them. They have the right to believe that way. There are others that say, no, it isn't, and they cite to me the Bible. Well, Jesus made wine at the wedding feast at Cana. So it's all right to drink. The Bible doesn't say you can't drink. And in all honesty, I'm not going to sit here and argue with you whether or not a drink of wine is sin. But I think what I can argue with you, but those people think it's a very definite moral issue. I know a dear lady whose husband was killed by a drunk driver. She thinks it's a moral issue. I have a good friend whose husband beat her regularly when he was drunk. She thinks it's a moral issue. If my friends are going to use the Bible that Jesus made, turn water into wine, and I could get into a lot of things about, Moses turned water, the Nile, into blood as a sign of death and sorrow. Jesus turned water into wine as a future sign of eternal life. But the point is, the Bible consistently condemns drunkenness.